everyone, or afternoon or evening, depending where you're joining us from today, and welcome to today's Diversity Talks webinar. Now, over the next 60 minutes, we're going to delve deep into the findings of the AESC report, Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, Creating Competitive Advantage Through Fairness, Inclusion and Belonging. My name's Sarah Mortimer, and I'm the AESC's Managing Director for APAC. Now, the AESC, for those who are not familiar with it, is the Association of Executive Search and Leadership Consultants. It's the global association that represents the profession of executive search and leadership consulting. In order to join AESC, search firms must pass our association's rigorous quality and ethical standards, so candidates and clients can be assured that they are looking at the best of the best to be working with. As part of our AESC governance, we have diversity-focused councils across the globe, and we have 5 of these in total. Our councils meet several times each year to discuss current diversity, inclusion and equity best practices, while maintaining a focus on our diversity pledge that shares a commitment to combat all forms of discrimination within our own organisations, with candidates and clients we serve, and also within our wider communities. You can find out more about AESC and the Diversity Councils on our website. Okay, I'm delighted today to introduce you to our panel. Now, we have got members across our IDEA Council for APAC. So these are from AESC quality firms that sit on our council. And in addition today as well, we are lucky to have one of our member clients also joining us. I'd like to ask each of our members to introduce themselves. So let's start off on the left-hand side there, and over to you, Sonal.
Excellent, thank you. I'm Sonal Agrawal. I'm dialing in from Mumbai in India. 3 roles really that bring me here. I chair Alto Partners globally. This is 60 offices worldwide. I run the Indian operations of Accord Group India, and I'm also on the AESC Global Board. We also do quite a lot of work in DEI, including running a nationwide Women's Leadership Awards along with a major newspaper in India every year.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us today. Looking forward to your insights. And Caroline.
Thanks, Sarah. Caroline Deaver, based in Melbourne with Odgers Bernston. I'm part of our global board practice, co-lead that in Australia, and I'm part of the public sector practices as well. And I'm a key member of the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Council in Australia with fellow colleagues here, and we work very closely with colleagues internationally around DE&I initiatives.
Great, thanks, Caroline. And Shun, over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. So hi, everyone. I'm Shun, and I sit in Singapore with Russell Reynolds Associates. I am the D&I practice lead globally for Russell Reynolds, and been doing DE&I for 15 years, which betrays my age, and doing that previously in companies like Shell, Microsoft, and Givalden before joining this side of the house. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you. Welcome. And Raj. Unmute, Raj, sorry.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Yes, so I'm Raj from Malaysia, and I'm the managing partner at Synergy Asia and Castria globally. I'm also a steering committee member of 30% Club Malaysia and the co-founding member of Malaysian Women Energy. In 2021, we were awarded the UN Women Asia Pacific Award for Gender Responsiveness and Marketplace due to the work we do in DEI and women empowerment. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Raj. And then over to you, Gabrielle, our client on the call today.
Thank you, Sarah. Gabrielle Curtin. I'm the Group Executive of Safety, Community, People and Services for Snowy Hydro. Snowy Hydro Limited, for those of you who don't know, is Australia's largest hydro renewable generator. I've been at Snowy for about 9 years. Shun talked about betraying her age. Well, I was championing diversity before I knew it was a thing. So about 35 years ago, as a graduate with Shell Australia, being sort of in some ways thrown out into marketing reseller into the back ends of South Australia and Northern Territory, and worked with all sorts of very well-meaning, mostly men in depots, in distributorships, in service stations. So I sort of feel like today I'm part of the first guard. I've worked in many traditional male-oriented organisations and have always used my impact, role and influence to very much bring women in particular to the table. And in recent times in my job have the both challenge and the opportunity to really increase young women into the emerging talent pipelines, into STEM roles that are certainly part of the future.
Thank you. So as you can see, great experience and quite a diverse panel across the geos as well. So really looking forward to delving into some of these questions with you. So the AESC report, Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, was published at the end of last year. And to help us understand how organisations a lead in DEI transformation, we turned to selected clients from AESC members who are driving DEI in their own companies. Now, the report brought together findings from 52 interviews with clients from 22 of our AESC global firms. And the report itself is divided into 3 sections. So we're going to dive into each of those sections in turn. So the first section looked at the DEI change model, and it was an 8-step framework based on the work of the foremost expert on leading change, John Cotter. So let's kick off with some questions around change. Now, Sonal, I'm going to start with you. What are the first steps towards a DEI change in an organisation, and who leads that, and who takes ownership?
I think it's well documented that the CEO and the board really need to take ownership of this agenda, and it needs to come from the top, which is quite obvious. I think their role is really at the start to set the agenda, to set the sort of desired outcomes, or what the organization might look like during and after this journey. But I think more important, it's important to keep it simple. It's important to keep it authentic to who the organization is and what the objectives are. To talk more about not just diversity numbers, which a lot of people get lost in, but about inclusivity and making a space for initiatives to build out, creating frameworks of people and teams that will be able to implement or drive changes. But more than anything else, just setting the tone, the agenda, the voice of the organization consistently for this whole program.
Thanks, Sonal. And Raj, what would you add to those points?
Yeah, dovetailing from Sonal's key points, I would say the needle has shifted. We should start by having DEI at the heart of the ESG agenda, and following that, identify the purpose. And I would agree with Sonal. A good way to start is also through an employee engagement survey. It helps to identify existing strengths and areas for improvement. It also allows leaders to make informed decisions about where to focus their efforts. In terms of leading and owning, the CEO should be leading it and walking the talk. They will then inspire trust, confidence, and engagement from employees at all levels. Ownership, it should be owned by every stakeholder from top to bottom in the company. It's not CEO. And what it shouldn't be is that DI sits under HR.
Thank you for that. And from the change model, from the 8-step journey, I'm going to go to Shun next. Can you choose a step that resonates with you and then share with us why that is?
Yeah. So I would choose step number 7, which is sustain momentum on the change model. And that resonates with me because that's probably one of the hardest things to do. Very often you might find that people react and drive D&I because of a trigger, sometimes externally or internally. And that sparks a movement. Sometimes it's personality based. You have a champion. But embedding that into the ways of the organization, to the DNA and the culture, so that you're able to sustain that momentum and keep that progress going, is hugely critical and an important piece of really making an impact that is credible to employees, and that is not just a fad of the moment or a leadership focus just at that point in time.
Yes, that's often one of the dangers. It's seen as a fad. Caroline, same question to you as well. Which step and why?
Look, I would agree with Shun, but I'd also say step 6 is really important to continue momentum, which is about celebrating the short-term wins. And it's about how you include all parts of the organisation in your activities. And we know that progress takes time and the small steps keep momentum up, but they also enable conversations to take place that are important for people to really share their experience as well as tell their own stories. So I think it's a range of activities that get you where you need to go, both short and long term, but those short-term celebrations done consistently with intent really help maintain momentum in an organisation. And you need to be inclusive at all levels with that momentum.
Great, thanks for that, Caroline. And Gabrielle, what do you see as the step that resonates for you?
Thanks, Sarah. I'm sure we all like the front end of the model, but certainly the one that resonates for me most is number 8, and I do think Cotter's model has stood the test of time. The reason why number 8 resonates with me, I think to create lasting change challenges each of us to start with the end in mind. And if we start with the end in mind, then we're thinking 20 years out, as well as thinking about where the organisation sits within the particular ecosystem. I think the other thing for me about number 8 and sustaining change is that it becomes not about me, because it's something that has to be carried on by others in the organisation well after, in my role or as a CEO or whoever it might be.
And Caroline mentioned around the celebrating short-term wins. That probably falls into step 8 as well. How do you do that within your organisation, Gabrielle?
Well, I thought Caroline answered it really, really well. I think what I would say about the short-term wins is it's always about the small things, and it's always about the shifts that people see. So I think leaders forget that they're being watched all the time, how they speak, the change in tone. People are watching. So I think visible leadership, moving from, particularly in an engineering safety organisation, from root cause and blame to putting one's hand up and taking accountability, and then being thanked for that by management and leadership. I think whether it's about values development, whether it's about diversity, the leadership and board have got to set the agenda, as was said earlier. But I think the ability then for the whole organisation to be involved in the development of all of the detail really makes a difference. So look, I could go on, but I think shining a light on those things that matter and doing that are really short-term wins. I think it's important because I think it gives you momentum. And it also, I think, says, well, we can't change. We haven't declared victory yet.
Right, that's very important statement, that one. So now, anything that you'd add? I saw you nodding your head there to a lot of what was said.
No, just vehemently agreeing.
Excellent. So what are the effective ways or examples to communicate DEI concepts internally? It's often a very hard thing. How can we actually bring everybody onto the same picture? Shun, let's hear from you on this.
So for me, I think it's very important to understand the organization's makeup of its employees, not to get too technical with technical definitions. So metaphor, something visual that makes sense to the organization helps. So if I use a few examples, if you were in the food industry, then talking about diversity as a mix of nuts and how that comes together in a complementary way, right? Helps employees rank and file through to the top, talk about it. When I was in Gévaudan, I often talk about the flavors and the fragrances, the diversity of that, and the connection that we make through flavors and fragrances. So how do you bring the concept to life in a way that underpins the purpose of the organization, the DNA and the culture and the people, and really important, it has to serve the lowest denominator. So making sense, if you work hard at translating the concepts to people, for example, on the shop floor, it will then translate naturally upwards to the rest of the organization. The challenge sometimes is we design and talk about these definitions at the top of the house, right, with the leadership team, and that becomes a very academic exercise, and you lose that translation to rank and file.
Caroline, what would you add to that around communication? How can we really make the best of that?
Look, I think some really good points raised there. I'd also say that building coalitions in your organisation is really critical, and it's got to be delivered bottom up, top down. So yes, board and CEO are absolutely critical, but it's got to come from all parts of your organisation, and you need to bring different groups together to hear, see and understand the strategies and programs that are important. And there are a range of ways of doing that: policy development, specific retention and attraction strategies. I think certainly, having DE&I on your agenda at every town hall, it should be on your agenda in your whole of organisation conversations. I think the other thing that's important is creating an environment of cultural safety. And, we hear a lot about this, but really that's at the heart of the organisation. And it does allow you to start having more courageous conversations about the lived experience of diverse employees. And it's often when you hear those stories that you understand more, and it can help you drive cultural change at all levels of the organisation.
And I think driving the culture change at all levels really builds well into the next section of the report, when we start looking at the ecosystem where change happens in context. And it's reaching beyond the workplace into the marketplace and also into our communities as well, and the communities that we work in and we live in. So Raj, I'll come to you for this next question. Culture change is a long and complicated process. Many of our AESC member firms work in this area, everyone on this call being one of those leaders. Now, what can leaders committed to DEI learn from efforts to shape and align organizational culture? You're on mute again, Raj, sorry.
Again, sorry for that. So in our experience, impactful culture change begins with the CEO, and they drive change through a culture council made up of key stakeholders. CEOs we have worked with are themselves empathetic leaders who lead with thought, behavior, decisions, and actions, because they're being watched. So they lead the right way, they role model the right thoughts, behaviors, decisions, and actions, and it's all aligned with their new culture. Now, besides articulating and communicating the vision clearly, what would be really good is developing value descriptors, what it means to you and me, and creating a playbook of different examples of the values being displayed in the business. Therefore, everybody will find it very relevant to their role and how they work in the company. Now, besides just mindset and behavior change, this has to be reflected also in your internal systems, processes, and procedures. And lastly, what gets measured gets managed. Establish KPIs and metrics. Regularly assess and evaluate the effectiveness of these initiatives. Collect feedback from employees and adjust strategies as needed based on data-driven insights and feedback from the floor. Thank you.
Thanks, Raj. And I've always loved that saying, what gets measured gets managed. So from a executive search perspective, if we put our executive search hats on for a moment, the AESC research indicates that the advantages of diverse perspectives are only realized when those perspectives are heard. So if we look at inclusive leadership as being critical in making sure that everyone has the ability to fully contribute, what do we look for in a search for an inclusive leader? Or how would you assess a candidate to determine if they are actually an inclusive leader? Caroline.
Thanks, Sarah. Look, I think people look for alignment with their leaders and they want their values to match their employers' values. So creating an environment where people want to be part of, that can share the benefits of coming together, it really drives intrinsic satisfaction for employees. So when looking for inclusive leadership, I mean, the sorts of things we might assess, we're really looking at the capabilities such as behaviours and mindsets, cumulative past performance, so not just the last job, but cumulative past performance is really important. And I think we're looking for demonstrable evidence of how their leadership has driven performance through inclusive strategies. So I think Gabrielle talked earlier about that visible commitment, and that's really important. So how a leader empowers others, the curiosity that they bring to seeking diverse views, and how a leader holds others accountable to inclusive work practices. Team composition can be one way to really assess how leaders are performing. But again, I think it's about that demonstrable commitment that a candidate shows around inclusive leadership.
Thanks for that, Caroline. And Sonal, what would you add to that?
I agree with Caroline. I'd add that when we're interviewing candidates or when we're assessing people, I think some of the things we focus on are EQ to start with, and hard to quantify what that might look like or how they've implemented diversity strategies in their jobs, etc. But very simple things like when they communicate, when they talk about their achievements, is it always an I or a we? And who do they credit for their success? That's a big indicator for me in terms of just general acknowledgement of teams, diverse or otherwise, that go a long way in sort of identifying what sort of person this is. Their ability to include others in conversations, to listen as well as to hear rather than talk. I look for evidence in terms of how they solve problems. Do they lead their teams to come up with solutions? Do they provide solutions and expect people to just execute that? And some of these questions sort of maybe bring to life what Caroline was talking about in terms of how you actually assess this and try and get some insights in terms of how people actually operate. And the biggest thing for me is when they acknowledge their teams, the metrics, obviously, in terms of how many people on their team, how they think about it, are important, and I'm not taking away from that.
Thanks, Sunal. Shun, did you want to add to this conversation as well?
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, I would definitely like to weigh in a little bit, because the interesting thing is when we are interviewing, I always remember a piece of research from Harvard Business Review that talked about how leaders who rate themselves as being inclusive tend to overrate themselves. And then interestingly, leaders who rate themselves as not as inclusive actually are underrating themselves. So there is this, if you ask them directly, they probably either under or overrate. Oftentimes then what I look for in the conversation is the notion of, are they aware of their privilege? Because I think that self-awareness hugely critical in then determining if the leader has a internal compass that guides them with awareness around inclusion, around their privilege, and around therefore having empathy in their approach with others in the organization, both in terms of coaching, allyship, and advocacy.
Thanks for that, Shun. Gabrielle, we've talked a little there about the executive search side. If I throw this question out to you, pioneer leaders are using their influence outside of the workplace to shape perceptions and reduce biases. So this might be along challenging long-held beliefs about men's roles in families or women in traditional male jobs and stereotypes about people's backgrounds. Seems like an enormous task. Why do you think they're doing this?
Thanks, Sarah. And I do think that Caroline, Shun and Sunal really did help lead into this one. Without misstating the obvious, I think the old model of only being accountable to your shareholder for one thing, short-term EBITDA or dollars, is long gone. Shareholders, they want a much broader set of metrics. They want different results. They're not singularly focused. And just as the earlier speakers have spoken about what they look for in a CEO, I think that's exactly what employees look for. I think the ecosystem model is really, this is a great question to really bring this to life, because it shows clearly that CEOs and organisations don't operate in isolation. They operate in community and they operate in their marketplace. And it's pleasing to see that shareholders have such a broad set of interests these days, and it's not just staff, regulators, contractors, suppliers, traditional owners and others. But people in an organisation, they want to know, as Caroline was saying earlier, are my values aligned to you? Can I trust you? What do you stand for? Do I really want to work for this organisation? And certainly with the Gen Zs in particular, that's becoming even more important. They want to see the person behind the job title. And I suppose we all do go to the supermarket, and we, you know, some of us may go to the school fete or to sports or whatever it is. And being something other than this wooden character, I think, is really important. The last point I'd make, and this is just a hypothesis, but certainly in Australia, as we've seen volunteering and people knowing everyone in their community and working more closely together in those little ecosystems, as they have decreased, if you like, in primary courses, I think people's views of the importance of what the organisation is doing and what it does for them and for others has become increasingly important. And that's probably not surprising, because we are all looking for that social and meaningful connection.
Thanks for that, Gabrielle. Raj, did you want to join in? Do you go to the supermarket, and are you going to sporting events? What's your perspective here?
Yeah, there's an interesting observation I made, right? So as part of the 30% Club Malaysia, we interact a lot with board members and CEOs of PLCs to join the campaign for diversity on board. And what I've noticed from the male CEOs, either they come on board to the pitch and agree to join the board, join the campaign because of the investor group pressure. But eventually, when I have a discussion with them, interestingly, they mentioned that they are supporting this because of their daughters. So male leaders who have daughters, they believe they should start paving the way to make it a more inclusive workplace because they want their daughters to thrive and shine. So that's why I would say male leaders, for instance, those male allies who actually walk the talk because of their own personal, what they stand for and what they want for their family.
Thanks for that add-on there. Now moving on to the last section of the reports. Obviously, coming out of any reports like this, coming from the interviews, there are lessons to be learned. So let's just delve into this area a little. Can you provide insights into how organisations in APAC have translated their commitment to DEI into tangible policies? And to build on that, how have they ensured engagements from all levels of their workforce to reinforce DEI? And please share with any of those challenges, also the successes as well. So Shun, quite a meaty one here.
I think the challenge always in this region is translating what is often seen as a Western or even an American concept or even a Western perspective of the problem statement and solutions into Asia. I think I'll just talk about the challenges a little bit first. Couple of different things, right? Like say the regulatory environment provides certain challenges around how we might talk about certain dimensions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Example, sexual orientation, gender identity, LGBTI. And it's really important for us to be very sensitive to this in then how we address the policy in order to be truly inclusive and equitable. Another example is just the time zones. Very often when we think about hybrid working, when we think about flexibility or remote working, the implications of being at this end of the time zone and hence many people working later hours of the evening to accommodate a global organization, and the reality of infrastructure where, for example, homes in urban environments are smaller, creates also unique challenges specific to Asia Pacific. Unlike many other parts of the world, we do not have, say, a separate home office. The home office is often, for many parts of Asia, that dining room table in the middle of the house. And that presents unique challenges around inclusion when we think about how people then take their calls with family life happening in the background. So those are some examples of how when we think about policies and practices, how leaders with privilege, perhaps, and with understanding are able to ensure that when we talk about what flexible working means, what hybrid working means, what remote working means, for example, or about, say, policies around medical benefits, take all of these nuances into consideration in designing truly inclusive policies. And the best way to do that is to create that, and we talked about that, I think Caroline has mentioned that, Raj has talked about that, Gabrielle as well, the way that the leader uses their influence to shape the culture, to create that psychological safety for employees to speak up, because the design of these can't be achieved without the voice from every single employee who is then feeling safe to lean in and provide perspective as to how these policies can support them.
Raj, would you like to add to that?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. So I would address the challenges as well first. I think we have spoken enough on the other areas, policies and so on. Similar to what Shun was saying, I would like to start with the resistance to change. It's common when implementing new DEI policies and practices. Some of our male clients and candidates have the fear of it being a zero-sum game. So if there are more women who accelerate into leadership positions, then do I get a job? Or Raj, when you shortlist candidates, do you count the men out? So there is this fear that the resistance change because of the zero-sum game that is just perceived in the mindset. And it's a threat to their privileges, right? And also the lack of understanding of why it matters to them as a future leader. So we believe organizations must address these concerns proactively and engage employees in dialogue to build buy-in and support for their efforts. Most importantly is to make every other benefit they have, make it not just for women or minorities, it has to be inclusive and being implemented by the majority themselves. Because so some of the male leaders, for instance, they do not want to use the benefits given to them on how they live to watch football, because then they'll be seen as a weaker leader, right? So I think male leaders play a role as well in the area of gender diversity, where they should also use and support these benefits given to them. The other challenge is language and communication barriers. There are some programs we've done with our clients, especially in multicultural workplaces. Language and communication barriers can hinder effective collaboration and understanding. Therefore, organizations must invest in language training and communication tools to overcome these barriers and ensure that all employees can participate. So you can imagine, right now, Singapore being a regional hub, Malaysia is a regional hub. In any one workplace, you have a plethora of different nationalities, gender, multi-generational workforce. And most often the way a Malaysian speaks and the way a European speaks will be different. If you don't understand the nuances, there will be conflicts, and this has to be addressed. On this topic, I missed the first point, the first section about, how do you communicate DEI concept? What I've seen really works and has an impact in communicating DEI concept, which otherwise becomes theoretical, and in fact, unconscious bias training. There's a Harvard study that shows unconscious bias training has actually increased more biasness among leaders. So what I've seen that really works is an exchange theater, where these are all professional actors who actually play out, a typical workplace dynamics issues, where you see different personalities and all the underlying assumptions and biases. And then they get the participants to role play, and these participants are the employees, and they get to reflect and see that, hey, I'm guilty of saying that, hey, I've done this, right? And they get participate. So when they see their behaviors up on stage being acted out by actors, it's a better, more holistic way of addressing unconscious bias, not by gender, but it's just by personality types, by age group, and so on, right? So I think to address language and communication barriers, exchange data will be good. Last but not least will be similar to what Shun has mentioned, cultural sensitiveness and norms. Malaysia, especially there's some areas of diversity spectrum that you can't address. So this does pose challenge to DEI effort, as they have different understandings in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thanks, Raj. Sonal, did you have an example to share with us?
I do. We work quite closely with a very large conglomerate. There are about 180,000 people in pretty much everywhere in the world. And they, over the last decade, have moved, they focused on women. They already have a number of nationalities and ages, etc., in their workforce. And they're all in heavy industries, commodities, etc. They've moved their numbers from 11% to 21% in 7 years. And I was like, how on earth did you do that? Fantastic, over so many locations and industries. And, apart from the usual things, all cert slates must have 30% women, the intake must be blah, 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 all of that stuff. I think 2 or 3 of the things that she said, the group talent person said to me, really resonated. Part of it was just making sure that there are enough women in leadership roles or in visible roles. So not necessarily just in leadership, even at mid levels, but just focusing on the fact that there needs to be a diverse audience in every room, in every management committee, etc., and pushing that agenda a little bit. They also managed to turn all of their theories into policy by talking about mid-career specialized training for different groups. And these are customized programs that they've developed. One of the things, and this is perhaps quite Indian, which was quite unique, was that they have a nanny policy, which was incredible. So when a woman comes back from maternity, that's the single biggest time when people drop off. They allow business travel for these women along with a nanny and the baby. And they found that this simple provision for this has moved the needle in terms of women not stepping out, of continuing to perform their roles, which include travel, etc., because they have the supports. Everybody has a crash in the office, but this took it one step further in a big way. When we go out to them saying we're running the ET Women's Leadership Awards, can you nominate people? And I compare them with another conglomerate that we work with. We reached out for nominations. These guys said, give us a week, we come back. And they came back with very thoughtful people in different parts of their business who they wanted to showcase for the Women's Award. The other conglomerate never responded to our messages. And I think this is a very visible and committed way that leadership has to say, hey, we will celebrate, we will push the agenda, we will make sure this is visible, not just internally, but in the wider audience that we're doing all of this. And I mean, they have a 7-step program, they're consistent, they've been running it for all of these years, the numbers show that they work, etc. But I thought some of these little things actually translate the strategy and the talk into action, and I found that fascinating.
Thanks, Sanal. Very interesting. So some great examples there. What methods are companies using to actually measure the positive impact of DEI? What are we seeing out there that really makes that difference on business performance? And again, on the flip side, are there any pitfalls we need to think about with this as well? Soon, I'll come to you.
Yeah. So I would say that what I've seen in the work I've done with clients is it's really important to be intentional, to think about how you're going to measure the impact. And maybe quoting from Gabriella, beginning with the end in mind. So why are you doing DE&I? What purpose does it serve? So what if you achieve your objectives? And it's not just about the KPI or the metric of diversity representation. If that should be a means to an end. And the leadership team, the CEO and the C-suite needs to sit down and actually have that discussion about what impact they want to see. So for example, is it about innovation? Is it about safety? Is it about the better bottom line? And then putting in place measures that actually will track that. Because for example, if you are a company where safety is an important license to operate, then how do you leverage diversity and how do you create a safe working environment that is psychologically safe for people to speak up, address cultural issues or language issues that might prevent you from being able to operate safely? Those are important considerations that affect the design of your policies and processes, and therefore the way that you would then measure impact tied to initiatives around that. Different company, another client for whom, say, diversity is about the way that products better serve clients, better serve customers in terms of, say, skincare or healthcare, might then be thinking differently about how diversity shows up in their R&D team, in their marketing team, and so on and so forth. And therefore, then measures might include B2C type measures around customer satisfaction, around sales, and so on and so forth. So I think it's really, really important to ensure that there is that tie between what you're trying to achieve from a diversity perspective with business outcomes. And the pitfall is actually the reverse, right? When everybody just looks left and right and say, yeah, we want to do diversity, we want to then just follow everyone else and come up with a snazzy title like 50% women by 2050 or something like that, right? But not really sitting down and thinking about what that means. Because when they do that, then to, I think, Raj's point about how it becomes something very, very focused on a KPI. You disenfranchise everyone else in the organization that isn't that metric. For example, you're not bringing the entire organization along, plus you cause leaders and managers to actually gamify that metric, which is to the detriment of the organization.
Sonal, are you seeing the same in the organizations you're working with?
I think so. I think one of the things that people measure is not just the metrics of, the intake, and then finally at the end, what the percentage is of communities that they're trying to keep. I think they look at the process and how many people, or how many, and if I talk about women in particular, how many stay, how many grow, how many are promoted, how many times they're in the room, etc., just as indicators of where they are. All of this is fine. I think people measure in different ways. What was interesting in this particular client that I mentioned is they also used to measure their overall success of this program as overall retention numbers, male, female, all sort of major interest groups, etc., to say, are we a more attractive employer overall? Are we in great places to work? Is our retention overall better, not just for women? In which case this is working in a truly inclusive way, not just for a part of our community. And I thought that was an interesting approach to see, or interesting lens through which to look at this.
Thanks, Sunal. So, Gabrielle, can accountability be taken too far and end up driving the wrong behaviours, a bit underpinned with the best intentions? What can we do to avoid this?
I think it's a great conversation, what we've just been talking about, and I hadn't actually thought about it this way previously, but if accountability for someone in a global role is it's got to be global policies and this is how it's got to be rolled out and this is the language, etc., we actually ultimately kill what we're trying to do, because by definition, a DEI culture means that it hasn't just turned up out of Chicago or turned up out of London or turned up out of wherever. So I think there's a whole other conversation in there too about the responsibility of the people who set the tone and set the policies and set everything else that goes with it and those parameters, to actually understand not just where their clients and their customers and others are, but where is that culture. So when Shun talks about, East versus Western cultures, it's just, certainly in my experience, worked in some global organisations, this is the way because this is the way we believe it's the right way. And maybe DEI has the opportunity to actually challenge that from areas where you may not be part of the main influencing engine that's sitting there. So I just thought that conversation that you were just having was quite illuminating for me. I mean, I think it's a bit like I talked about before. Reaching audacious goals isn't linear or singular. It's a bit like incentives. If you make them too one way and not multidimensional, you always get the behaviour you incentivize. So you always get the behaviour if accountability is set a particular way. But most things in life, unless they are some of what we've witnessed in the last few years come out of macro events from nowhere, most change is iterative. And certainly with DEI, I've found it's 2 steps forward, 1 back. You've just got to make sure that as you keep moving, you don't lose heart. I'm not a scientist, but when I was thinking this question, I thought about Newton's law. For every action or force in nature, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And if you're very ham-fisted with all things D&I, whether it be cultural, whether it be gender, whether it be age, whether it be having a global brand and trying to sell that and project it in a singular focus, I think it's a recipe at some point for things to go awry. And lastly, I think with accountability, when it's set in such a, it's interesting, without me getting too diverted off the topic, when I was at Shell back in the 90s, there was a number of multinational companies that did some work on cultural competence. And what they found was that when the Americans, when JFK said we're going to put a man on the moon, the Americans knew that they couldn't do that, but they were inspired by it. And at the time, they said that the survey data had shown that if you said to the Australians, we're going to put you on the moon, we're going to put a man on the moon, and there was no way that you could see it, we were probably going to say get stuffed or other words to that. So I do think accountability and not understanding your customers and your staff in multiple different countries, geographies and cultures could take away and diminish all of what one is trying to do in a very well-meaning way.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Now, we're also just taking that to another level as well. We're seeing an alarming pendulum swing towards anti-DEI movements that insist that DEI is, in fact, reverse discrimination. So what should boards and CEOs do and say to address this DEI backlash? Caroline, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Sarah. Look, I think the backlash has come about for a range of reasons, and there is a lot of debate at the moment, and it seems a lot of the criticism is based on DE&I becoming over-politicised and identity politics, particularly in the US, where we've seen the reversal of affirmative action, and that certainly had an effect. So I think the subsequent rethinking of DE&I strategies has also been affected by the pandemic and, serious workforce issues, the ability to retain and attract talent. They're all putting pressure on productivity, and then you've got inflation and challenges with growth. So CEOs and boards are thinking about, slow growth. They're thinking about, how do we meet performance targets? And so I think, a lot of time and resources has been spent on diversity initiatives. And in some cases, there hasn't been the diagnostic on where an organisation is at and what the critical business case is. And then there's also this is the right thing to do as well. So I think within these tight labour markets, boards particularly, and this is our experience through the work we've done here in Australia, they're asking for better measurement of the activities that are taking place. And we've talked quite a bit about measurement today. But linking DE&I with business objectives, setting the right goals, how can they be measured? And, there's a fair bit of talk about virtue signalling as well, and a bit of backlash to that. And I think that's because, those activities are not measured, and it can be lip service rather than something tangible and substantive. So it's really about thinking about a measurable program of activities and assessing those for effectiveness. And effectiveness is the evidence that you see in your organisation of cultural safety, of more courageous conversations, of really strong leadership pipelines of diverse individuals. And I think engagement, testing engagement is also really important. So I think that they'd be some of the things that I'd be advising boards and CEOs about around that topic.
Great, thank you. Now, we've just got time before we close. Just for a final quick tip or a word of advice from our panel. So I'll kick it off with you, Shun.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So my word of advice centers on two things for leaders: intentionality and grace. Oftentimes, I tell leaders that if you are not intentionally inclusive, you will actually unintentionally exclude. So it's really, really important to pause and be intentional in your efforts. And then the second thing I often tell them, because then that seems really daunting, is that if you give me effort, I will give you grace. And that's also very, very important for them to remember, so that it doesn't paralyze them into inaction. That's what I have to share.
Thank you. Caroline.
I think my tip would be about building a coalition of people in your organisation at all levels that can really push the agenda forward. And it's about being consistent. It's about staying true to the cause. And it's about holding yourselves to account, but also your leaders to account. And I think boards play a real responsibility in holding CEOs to account. But every level of the organisation, you should be holding yourselves and your leaders to account around the outcomes you need.
Thanks, Caroline. Excuse me. Gabrielle?
Sarah, for me, I think you've got to make it mainstream. As Raj said, I think at the front end, this isn't owned by HR, and if it's owned by HR or a task force, it's doomed to fail. So it does have to be mainstream, and ultimately I think it is about managing risk to leverage strategy, and it's a long game. It's you've got to take your narcissistic self out of it and think that what you're doing is building the foundation for those that come after you.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Sonal.
Mine will be really quick. I think it's about authenticity and consistency. Pick your vectors, do the right thing, and the outcomes will follow.
Thank you. And Raj? Unmute, Raj.
That's Raj again. Sorry. Yeah, for those of you who don't know where to start, weave DEI into the heart of your ESG agenda. So that it's more long-term and not tick the box. And every other decision follows its impact. Next advice would be, don't go out and hire for diversity until you build an inclusive workplace with what you have right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Some excellent words of advice there from the panel. And thank you to our excellent panel for joining us today. Now, I hope you found today's discussion informative. Thank you all for joining us, the panel for their insights. It's been really interesting, very appreciative. Thanks everyone for listening, and that concludes today's session. So you may now disconnect. Thank you.